with the legend of how paper came to the Muslim world. And that's exactly what I'm going to talk about now. So, when Muslim armies conquered Central Asia in the late 7th and early 8th century, so they came, Islam developed in Mecca and Medina in Arabia, and then by the 630s, they were in Syria and Palestine, and in the 640s, they had conquered what is now Egypt, and at the same time, they were moving into Iraq, and then into the Iranian plateau, the highlands of Iran. And so then we get to, by the late 7th century and early 8th century, they're moving into what is called Transoxiana, or Central Asia, that is the region northeastern Iran and into what is now Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and so on. Muslims encountered paper for the first time when they conquered this region. Now, it is often said that Muslim armies captured Chinese paper makers following the Battle of Talas in 751, which is, Talas is somewhere, it's on some of these maps, but it's not, it's somewhere up there, and it's like Nowheresville. And this was a battle that took place between Muslim armies and Chinese armies. And the Muslims actually won the battle, but they decided not to go any further. The supply lines were too long. And so basically, for centuries, Islam did not go any further in Central Asia. Just to keep you in the sort of bigger picture, in 731, so 732, actually, 20 years earlier, 19 years earlier, there was a battle between the Muslims and the French, 732, the famous Battle of Poitiers, where Charles Martel of the Franks defeated the Muslims. So this gives you, in a 20-year period, 2 decades, we have this empire that's stretching from the Atlantic to Central Asia. And this is the world we're turning to. Anyway, there's this story that's reported by a writer of the 11th century named Thalabi, who says that the paper is known from, is famous in Samarkand in Central Asia, and was brought to Islam, to the Islamic world, by the capture of Chinese paper makers at the Battle of Talas. Now, he's writing in the 1000s. This event took place in 750. So it has all the authority that I have about writing about my good friend George Washington or something like that. I mean, what we really have to do is look, why was this story told? And what the story is that, as I was saying at the break, it was impossible in the medieval Muslim imagination to say something like paper was invented in China and was carried to Central Asia and Muslims encountered it there. It was just, this is not a way that you could say something, because the way you wrote history, the way you thought about history, was through the responsible acts of individuals. And so you had to have that John Doe brought paper from China to Samarkand or something. You had to pin it on some person was guilty. So this was a way for this historian in the 10th century or 11th century to talk about these earlier events by inventing these individuals. And you could ask, what were paper makers doing in the army? I mean, it's like, I could see bakers, I could see cooks, but paper makers? I mean, give me a break. Okay, anyway, so Muslims seem to have adopted paper for a variety of purposes. The first and most important was the administration of the empire, which demanded documents and records. And so you can see this empire was enormous and was nominally governed from Baghdad in Iraq. But the rulers had to know who was owed what, who had to pay what, who was to be given what, and so documents were essential. Unfortunately, virtually none of these documents has survived. Because in the intervening centuries, floods and wars and stuff, and this was not the kind of thing that people kept, these documents. So our earliest surviving official documents come from the 11th century or 12th century, and this is a document from Mount Sinai in Egypt, where the ruler of Egypt, the caliph in Egypt, is giving the monks of Mount Sinai permission to do certain things, certain rights and privileges. And it's a really interesting document because it's one of like 7 or 8 that survive. But also it tells us a lot. First of all, you can see its size from the hand that's holding it open. And then you can see the value of paper from it. Now, does this mean you can see that there are these lines of writing and there's a lot of space? Show of hands, who thinks paper is expensive? Who thinks it's cheap? No, then, what does that show? Does it show it's cheap or expensive? Cheap. Yeah, well, that's the ruler who's showing off how much paper he can use. And that's when you use quintuple spacing between the lines. You show off that I have all the paper in the world to show you. And so you have big script and, big margins and stuff like that. And this is, you can see, pasted up. It's just like all these other scrolls and things like that, pasted up from many different sheets. Now, here we don't see the writing going over the edge. There's a line of join. But here, this is a later document of the same format where this is from Iran in the 13th century, late 13th century, and this has a kind of Chinese-style seal over it. And you can see, here's the full document or part of it, and you can see that the seal goes over the places where the paper is joined, which is to make sure that someone doesn't add an additional sheet that says, and by the way, I bequeath all my possessions to Jonathan Bloom, or something like that. The other thing that's interesting about these 2 documents is that they're vertical scrolls as opposed to horizontal scrolls. And vertical scrolls, as you all know from your visits to Colonial Williamsburg or Old Sturbridge Village, are hear ye, hear ye. It's an official announcement. It's not something that you read. And that continues to this day. So here's another ruler. This is the Mongol ruler of Iran, Gaihatu, writing using an awful lot of space between the lines. Ordinary people, if they had paper, crowded in their words. And this is a page from the Gharib al-Hadith, which is the book about the unusual words used in the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, which is in Leiden in the University Library, and it is the oldest dated book on paper in Arabic known. There are stories that there are other books that are older, but they've never been properly published. Normal people were more parsimonious with paper. It is exactly contemporary with that first printed book that I showed you from Dunhuan in China, which is sort of a nice thing that we have the oldest paper book, and shows how quickly, really, in historical terms, this material traveled from China to the West. It has also, there are all sorts of wonderful features, but you can see it has paragraphs, paragraph markings and stuff. It's meant to be read and understood. But paper wasn't just used for religious books or books in the quasi-religious sphere. It was used for secular works as well. Here we have, can you tell what kind of book this is? I'm showing you illustrated books because it's no fun looking at just pages of text if you can't read it. And I'm an art historian, so I collect pictures. But this is clearly a book of geography, and this is a map. This is actually the map of the Aral Sea and the rivers flowing into the Aral Sea. This is a book of constellations. and this is the constellation Andromeda. This used to be considered one of the earliest copies until someone cleverly discovered that someone had just pasted in a fake date at the end of the book, you know? And, you know, you can see it on the internet, but you got to look to see it, you know, I mean, so, okay. This is clearly a book. These are two guys preparing medicine. I don't know why you need to show two guys preparing medicine. It's not real. But this is a kind of useful kind of diagram to have, and you can all tell what kind of book this is. This is on mathematics, of course, geometry, the Pythagorean theorem. But it wasn't only sort of what I would call serious literature or serious writing and stuff like that. We also have the growth of popular literature. And this book on the left is in Chicago, and it is the earliest known version of the Arabian Nights. And it dates probably, well, it says, it's a folded piece of paper here. And it was taken from a book. And it was the first page of this book, and it said, "The Book of 1,000 Nights" on the title page. But then someone took the page and started practicing for the bar exam and wrote these legal formulas, you know, like the party of the first part and the party of the second part, heretofore attest to the something or other. And then the idiot wrote down today's date. And so we know that this book was waste paper by like the 870s in Egypt where it was found. And so in the 1930s, a scholar, Nabia Abbott at the University of Chicago, studied this and proposed that it must have been copied at Damascus or in Syria around the year 800. And so it was important not only for the history of paper, but also for the history of the Arabian Nights, the books that we know as the Arabian Nights. The one on the right is is what I would call a Harlequin romance. At least that's all we can tell about. It's just the last page of a book about the guy and the girl. And as usual, the stories don't have a happy ending because they end up in two graves. And these two triangular things are the graves with like a willow tree growing between them. So, you know, they were united finally in death or something. Anyway, it's really, I mean, this is the kind of book that nobody even mentions, but it was a fragment and shows that writing on paper permeated many levels of society. It was not only Muslim society, it was also Christian society. This is in the Vatican. This is a manuscript of the Doctrina Patrum, which is a Greek manuscript copied around 800 at Damascus. And then on the right, this is a letter in Hebrew script, but probably in Arabic. And it's something called Judeo-Arabic, which is the kind of Arabic that the Jews of Egypt spoke in the Muslim world, and they used Hebrew characters, but they wrote it in Arabic. And this is from an extraordinary cache of paper documents that was discovered in a synagogue in Cairo in the 19th century, and it's called the Geniza, or storeroom. And many of these, most of them, are in Cambridge University Library. And these reflect the life and business interests of the Cairo Jewish community and the Mediterranean world. And they show that there was a kind of paper economy that went from Marseille and southern France to India, where merchants were buying and selling stuff and writing each other. And we know, for example, that this one merchant, Ben Yiju, went to Gujarat in India and wrote to his colleagues in Cairo, and he says, "I'm sending you this metal or metal scrap or something like that to do with, to trade, but please send me paper. They don't have paper here." So that's already very interesting that around the year 1050 or so, there wasn't any paper available in India. This was a world of books. The Islamic world was a world of books and book learning that was not caused by paper, but was facilitated by paper, much in the same way that when Gutenberg developed printing in the 15th century, paper was just one part of the equation. This is a representation of a library in probably in Baghdad. The manuscript was copied in the 13th century in Baghdad, and it shows, here are the bookcases, and these guys having a reading session under the bookcases. But there were about 100 books on the shelves. And this wasn't a special library. This wasn't, like the Baghdad Public or something like that, or the Khalifa Library. This was just an ordinary private home. We know, for example, that there were extraordinary quantities of books in this world. When the Caliph of Cordova, Al-Hakam II, added, when he had a library at the end of the 10th century, the late 900s, in Cordova, the library was supposed to have had 400,000 titles. Now, you hear a number like this, and you say, oh, Oriental exaggeration. They always, exaggerate so much, Well, yes, and 400 always, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, or there's the pavilion of the 40 columns, and the this, and 40 is the number, and 400,000 it's a round number, which means a lot. But so take off a zero. So we're still talking about 40,000 books. And that is like 10 times the number that the largest library in Europe ever had, the Library of Paris, which had about 3,000 books at the height of and over half of them were missing or not on the shelf. Typical. Anyway, Fez, the city of Fez, was said to have had 400 mills. Now, whether they were paper mills or grain mills or not, I don't know. But there were mills, and they made paper. Certainly, paper was produced in Fez, and there was a famed library in the Qarawiyyin Mosque in the center of the city, which still exists. Europeans learned about paper from the Muslim world, and through many different ways. One of them were merchants and traders and stuff. And so here is a letter that's preserved in the archives of Pisa, which is a letter from North Africa, the caliph in Tunis, to the ruler of Genoa. And so there was a certain diplomatic currency. There were merchants. I remember this is the time when the cities of Amalfi and Pisa and Genoa are sending merchants to places like Egypt and stuff. And these merchants must have learned from their co-merchants, their Muslim and Jewish other merchants, that paper was really useful. And we know that new forms of commercial documents developed in Italy and the trading regions of southern France at this time, where merchants develop all sorts of forms of writing down accounts and things like that for these commercial ventures that they were involved in. So that's one way. And they probably brought back, and we know they brought back bits of paper or bundles of paper with them to Europe, because some of these early documents are written on what is clearly paper made in the Muslim world. Another way was during what is called the Reconquest, or the conquest of Spain by the Christians, as the Iberian Peninsula shifted from Muslim hands to Christian hands, as the Christian kingdoms in the north pushed further south. They took over many of the the areas that had been under Muslim control, including the city of Shatiba in Arabic, which was known for growing linen, raising flax, and making linen cloth, and also making paper. And indeed, the paper in Spain was often known as shabti, the word for paper. Sometimes in Latin they called it pergamino de trapos, which would mean parchment made of rags, rag parchment. But sometimes they called it shabti in Spanish, or early Spanish. And it was the paper making was centered on the city of Xativa, in the province of Valencia. And as Valencia became Christian, that suddenly the ruler, James I, had to allot all these newly conquered lands to his knights and such. And so he had to have all these documents quickly, giving people title to the land. And so it's thought that paper was very convenient for writing out these documents. And here is one of these documents, which you can't see, but you can see it's a document. This is a document from the archives of the King of Aragon. The most important center actually became Italy. And Italian papermaking became most important. It was centered on several towns, on Amalfi, where the tradition has died out, but also particularly in Fabriano, which is in the Marche of Ancona, to the northeast of Rome, nestled in the mountains. And it had the advantage of having a lot of streams flowing through it, which could power, not only provided clean water for paper making, but also could power the mills that were used. And that one of the stories, Muslims certainly used water power for making their paper, but Europeans were better able to harness water power because of the steeper drop in the terrain. There was more potential energy in the water for running these mills, and they would have mechanical stampers, and here you just see one example in the museum in Fabriano, where the water would turn this wheel through gears and various things, and then it would move these stampers up and down, and you would put the old rags in the basins, and they'd get beaten. And so it was much easier than doing it by hand or with less efficient means. But we know that water-powered mills were used in Iran already in the 10th century. I mean, various sources tell us this. So it's not something that we don't know too much about the history of milling in this period. My theory, and I have no reason to believe it, but it's a good theory, and it's also related to my interest in food, is that the spread of water-powered mills goes along with the cultivation of rice, and that rice is introduced to the Mediterranean world, and you have to, in order to take the outer husk off rice, you have to pound it. And so I would imagine that the water-powered pounding mill went west along with paella. But we'll see. For my next life. Here is a imaginative reconstruction of Fabriano's paper-making industry in the Middle Ages. It was based on various things, using gelatin instead of starch to finish the paper, that you would dip the sheet in gelatin made from animal hides and glue rather than painting starch on the surface, which kept the ink from soaking into the paper. As you know, if you tried to write on a paper towel, you can imagine what would happen. So paper had to be coated with starch to prevent it from soaking up. The other feature was the development of a wire mold. Muslims had used a mold made of vegetable fibers held together with horsehair, probably, and the advantage was you could sew designs onto the wire, and I think you can see, but they're very faint. I have some other example. These are very faint marks, which we call watermarks. They really don't have anything to do with watermark, but here's one of the University of Iowa from a sheet I made. I was very annoyed. They never gave me the sheet to take home. But, and so the point is that paper had, as in the Islamic lands, a transformative effect on European culture. Commercial documents, new kinds of books in vernacular languages, new writers, women, laymen, and new ways of composition. And this is the subject for a whole other lecture and not one at the Asian Art Museum. But just to give you an example, this is a page from an autograph manuscript by the great Italian poet Petrarch. written on paper. It's in the Vatican Library. And you can see it, you can study it online. This is the most amazing thing. And what is so amazing to me is it's all crossed out. That, paper was becoming affordable enough that you could take a sheet, you could say, sort of like, I don't know, to be or not, to be or not, to be, and then you sort of cross it out. But it allowed a whole new way of thinking about writing, about thinking of creating and stuff. And of course, to take it back to art, I don't believe it's coincidental that that the arts of drawing and the arts of drawing developed at this time. We have here a late 14th century copy of after a painting, and that people could start doing drawings not only of things they saw, but of people or whatever, but of other paintings. It meant that ideas could move from one artist to another. There were all sorts of new ways of thinking, and of course the development of printing with the development of printing by Gutenberg. This was made possible, of course, by the expansion of papermaking in Europe at least a century or two before Gutenberg. That is, papermaking begins in Europe in the 1200s, and in the middle of the 1200s, and in the middle of the 1400s, we're seeing the development of printing. So there are 2 centuries when Europeans are making paper, but they're not yet printing books on it. And what they're doing with this paper is using it for commercial documents, for letters, for bills, for all sorts of things. And they're also exporting it. And the places they're exporting it are the places where they learned about papermaking from, that is the Muslim world. And they sell their paper so cheaply that they basically destroy the local industry. And so we have reports from Egyptian historians and such about how the quality of the paper has declined once the Europeans have brought it in and so. And this is actually a page from a manuscript, an autographed manuscript by a very famous Egyptian historian of the early 15th century, where he's using old paper. This word has nothing to do with the rest of the text. This is from one of those big documents that I was telling you or showed you earlier, where you have the big lines of script, and he realized he could just write around it. And so he would buy this leftover government paper at a discount and use it for keeping his notes. Muslims didn't like European paper, particularly because they worried about the watermarks that were in it. Most of the watermarks had symbols on them of either living things, animals, or worse, crosses. And everything, even if it was a unicorn, it had a cross on its head or something like this. And so there was even a religious opinion that was given about whether it's legal to copy the Quran on paper that had Christian images on Christian symbols on it. And this scholar from North Africa, from Fez, wrote, and he said, just as the Quran superseded all previous revelations, so too writing the Quran erases everything underneath it. So it was perfectly all right. That said, European papermakers were not dumb. And so they developed a particular watermark, which is known as the Tre Lunae, or the 3 moons, 3 crescent moons, which was largely exported to the Middle East and to North Africa. And they find it in places like West Africa, even into the 19th century. So here is our paper trail, the paper road, or instead of the Silk Road, which has taken us all the way from central China, all the way to Europe and of course, the Americas. So, I would argue, as you can imagine, that the paper road is a much better term. Paper is really useful. We have it all around us all the time, sometimes for good, like my books, and sometimes for bad. And, we all know, we all remember, 20 years ago they were telling us about the paperless office? And tell me, anybody in this room have less paper than they had 20 years ago? No. Okay. So, and what's really interesting is that apart from the material itself, none of this story is known to us today. The Arabic word for paper is khagad, and a sheet of paper is waraq, which is the same word as leaf, like a leaf on a tree or something like that. So, we don't talk about, the khagad, the whatever, or the waraqs and stuff like that. However, there is one little bit, and that is that, which is the word ream, which comes from the Old French reim, which comes from the Spanish risma, which comes from the Arabic rizma, which means a bundle or a bale. So you now have one factoid to win over your guests this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you.